Hello everyone. Graf Zeppelin is a bit of a raging cynic. This personality largely stems from her real-life service, or rather her lacking real-life service. Her career was plagued by delays into service rivalry and general misfortune that led to the Graf we have in game. Her child alt, Zeffy, is genuinely excited, if slightly dramatic, about growing up to become the Ironblood's first carrier, before life kicked her down and made her the blasphemous cynic we know. This is that story. The start of Graf's misery begins with, ironically enough, herself. While Germany had been interested in naval aviation for some time, Zeppelin was their first attempt at a carrier, so naturally she would have a few design flaws. It's to be expected. But the Germans weren't exactly going in blind. They had inspected Akagi, and acquired blueprints for flight deck equipment from her, as well as tried, unsuccessfully, to observe Furious, so they had a general idea of how to aircraft carry her. She was to carry a battery of 8 150mm guns, down from 203, for surface-only engagements. In an attempt to save weight, it was suggested these be placed in dual mount, but that got misinterpreted and ended up giving every gun a dual mount, increasing their number to 16. These would serve little use as carriers spend most of their time in combat away from the line of battle, using their greater range to avoid being spotted and fired upon. Carriers are large, they're thinly protected and struggle to maneuver against most threats. They shouldn't need to use their guns against surface combatants. The only one who did was Formidable, and even then she wasn't supposed to be there. At this time, all other navies were switching to dual-purpose guns instead of a high-low mix, using them as long-range heavy AA, and as secondary weapons if things got out of control. They had guns good enough for both, instead of the Kriegsmarines mixed 150 and 105mm secondary batteries. Her catapults were also a little suspect. They were pneumatically driven, which could allow her to launch 18 aircraft rapidly, but would require almost an hour to recharge, making me question how useful they would be should she find herself in a protracted battle. Even assuming it's 18 per cat, that's still not enough to get her entire 43-plane air wing flying, and she was intended from the outset to primarily launch via catapult. Their mechanisms were thinly protected below the 45mm armoured flight deck, but above the main armoured deck, potentially making them easily disabled. They also featured a rail system. Planes would be lifted onto collapsible trolleys by crane for launch. Something similar was planned for the Essex class, but was rejected for being too time-consuming. On top of all that was the usual Kriegsmarine problem, of their ships being rather large for their capabilities. Graf would end up displacing over 33,000 tons at full load, putting her in the same weight class as a standard hull Essex or Implacable. Her construction went fairly well for the most part. She had to wait a year for Gneisenau to finish before she could start, but things progressed smoothly. She even had her aircraft being developed and the first German naval pilots being trained, albeit modified Luftwaffe planes being flown by Luftwaffe pilots observed by the Kriegsmarine, but as you'll see,
the fact that they cooperated at all is a big deal.
On December 8th, 1938, she was launched and given her name, with a projected completion date of mid-1940. However, shortly after is where things would begin going wrong. By April 1940, Germany had conquered Norway and now had much more coast it needed to defend, and that meant a sudden demand for coastal artillery and AA guns. Later that month, all work on Graf was halted. Since her fire control system had been sold to the Soviets, it would take an extra 10 months to get her guns working, even if she was otherwise complete by the end of the year, and so her guns were taken and used to reinforce the Norwegian coast. To make matters worse, Hermann Göring, chairman of the Luftwaffe, had made off with her aircraft for use elsewhere amid the rising tensions between the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, because how dare the Kriegsmarine want their own aircraft for their own needs, under their own control rather than his. She would spend the next 2 years being used as an aircraft carrier-shaped warehouse for wood, occasionally being towed to safeguard her from Soviet airstrikes following the German invasion of the USSR. In 1942, a glimmer of hope appeared. It had become abundantly clear how important aircraft carriers had become, and work was ordered to continue, but it was an uphill battle. The Kriegsmarine wanted newer planes, purpose-built for carrier operations, but with Germany's aviation industry struggling to cope with wartime demands, such planes wouldn't be ready until 1946. She was intended to receive navalised Bf-109s and Stukas as an interim, but that came with a new problem. These were heavier than their ground-based counterparts and beyond what she could operate. Despite never spending so much as a day in service, Graf Zeppelin was in desperate need of a retrofit. Unfortunately, it was never meant to be. By 1943, Hitler had become so disillusioned with the Kriegsmarine surface fleet that he ordered it to be scrapped and recycled into new U-boats. He was able to be convinced that instead all work on ships near completion be halted, which was how Graf would spend the rest of the war, with no real crew, no aircraft, and no hope. And then things got worse. Come 1945, and the impeding arrival of the Red Army, Graf would be scuttled in harbour, running her completely useless to her new owners for the next few months. By March 1946, she was refloated, now in Soviet hands, who, may I remind you, had been lent HMS Royal Sovereign as Arkhangelsk for 5 years, and when she returned home was so completely ruined that most of her equipment was unserviceable and her turret rotation was jammed in the centre line. The Russians don't really do a good job taking care of their ships. Fortunately, her time with the Soviets was brief, and in 1947 she was used in a live fire exercise to learn how to sink aircraft carriers. A number of bombs of varying sizes, placed in cutouts to simulate the effects of dive bombing, were detonated, and she proved surprisingly resilient. But a pair of torpedoes would finally allow her to sink for good. And so ends Graf Zeppelin's story. One of a ship destined to be a trailblazer for German naval aviation, who would end up unfinished and rejected. It's no surprise that she turned out the way she has, after every possible spark of hope for having something of a life got stamped out. A blasphemous cynic, wishing deep down that someone would care. So give her a hug whenever you got a minute, or a ring, whichever you prefer. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.